There is a story that most people have never heard. A story that took place on a cramped stage in a Greenwich Village club in 1966, on a night when a well-known guitarist invited what he thought was just another unknown black kid to sit in during a break, and spent the rest of his career trying to explain what happened next. Today, we are going to take you through the full life of Jimi Hendrix, the man who redefined what a guitar could do, the self-taught left-handed genius from Seattle who arrived in London with nothing but a used Fender Stratocaster and a vision that nobody around him was equipped to understand yet. We are going to show you how he built a fortune, how he lived at the absolute peak of rock and roll excess, and how the same burning intensity that made him immortal consumed him before he reached 30. And we will come back to that stage in Greenwich Village, because that night is where everything begins. James Marshall Hendrix was born on November 27, 1942, in Seattle, Washington. His mother, Lucille, was 17 years old when he was born. His father, Al Hendrix, was away serving in the military, and by the time he returned, the family was already fractured. Lucille struggled with alcohol and eventually left. Jimi and his younger brother Leon were raised primarily by their father Al in a home where money was almost always short, and stability was a concept the family visited briefly and then lost again. Seattle in the 1940s and 1950s was not an easy place to be black. The city's jazz clubs on Jackson Street were some of the only spaces where black musicians could perform and be paid, and even those spaces operated under the constant pressure of segregation and the economic precariousness that came with it. Jimi grew up watching television. He was obsessed with it the way other kids were obsessed with sports. He watched westerns, watched variety shows, watched anything that had music in it. When he was around 11 years old, he picked up a ukulele that had one string and played it until the string broke. Then he played a broom handle. Then Al Hendrix, seeing something in his son that he could not quite name, bought him a cheap acoustic guitar for $5 from a friend. It was a right-handed guitar. Jimi was left-handed. He flipped it upside down and restrung it in reverse, and within weeks he was playing things on that $5 guitar that made people stop walking past the house just to listen from the sidewalk. He never took a lesson, not one. He learned by watching other musicians, by listening to records until the vinyl started to wear thin, by sitting in the back of clubs where Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters and B.B. King records played from the speakers and absorbing every note with a concentration that bordered on religious. By the time he was a teenager, he was already better than most of the adults he performed with. His high school band played school dances and local events, and even then, even at 15, there was something in the way he played that was different from everyone else, not just technically. The technique would come later and become extraordinary, but what was already there at 15 was the feeling. The sense that the guitar was not a separate object he was operating, but an extension of whatever was happening inside him. In 1961, at 18 years old, Jimi enlisted in the United States Army and was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He served as a paratrooper, completed over 24 jumps, and was awarded the Screaming Eagles patch. But he spent every free hour he had playing guitar. He eventually received a discharge in 1962, officially on medical grounds related to a parachute jump injury, though some accounts suggest his commanding officer had simply run out of patience with a soldier whose mind was always somewhere other than the parade ground. After the discharge, he moved to Nashville, then to New York City, and spent the next several years doing what barely surviving musicians do. He played guitar on the Chitlin Circuit, the network of venues across the American South and Northeast where black artists could perform for black audiences. He backed up artists including Little Richard, Ike and Tina Turner, and Sam Cooke. He was paid almost nothing. He slept on floors, ate when people offered him food, and played every night with an intensity that sometimes got him fired because he was out playing the headliner, and the headliner noticed. Little Richard fired him twice. Ike Turner let him go after similar complaints. Being too good was a problem that Jimi Hendrix would carry for the rest of his short life. By 1966, he had settled in New York and was leading his own small group called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, playing clubs in Greenwich Village for $25 and $30 a night. The village was alive in those years with folk music, protest music, the electric folk of Bob Dylan, and a rock scene that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. One night at a club called Café Wah, a night that has been documented by multiple witnesses and has entered the mythology of rock history, Jimi was playing a set when a guitarist from a more established New York band arrived specifically because word had gotten around that there was some unknown kid playing things nobody had heard before. The visiting guitarist was confident. He had a reputation. He walked up to the stage during the break and invited himself to play. The kind of move that in the world of jazz and blues carries an implicit challenge. Let us see what you have got. What happened next lasted approximately 8 minutes. Jimi handed him a guitar and watched him play for a few bars, studying his hands, his technique, his habits. Then Jimi picked up his own Stratocaster. What he played in response was not a virtuosic showdown of scales and arpeggios. It was something else entirely. He played behind his back. He played with his teeth. He coaxed sounds from the guitar that the instrument had no engineering reason to be capable of producing. He used the tremolo arm to bend notes into frequencies that sounded like sirens, like crying, like something not quite human. The room went very quiet in the way rooms only go quiet when everyone present understands simultaneously that they are watching something they will not see again. The visiting guitarist stopped playing after the first minute and stood to the side with his arms crossed, not hostile, just quietly understanding that he had made an error in judgment. When it was over, someone asked the visiting musician what he thought. He said, "I had no idea. I genuinely had no idea." Most accounts agree he left the club shortly after. That moment was witnessed by Chas Chandler, the former bass player of the British group The Animals, who had come to New York specifically looking for new talent to manage. Chandler saw Jimi play that night and told him within the week that he was going to take him to London, sign him to a management deal, find him the best musicians available, and make the rest of the world understand what he was seeing. Jimi had $40 in his pocket, and what eyewitnesses described as a completely calm expression when he agreed. He was not surprised. He had always known. He was just waiting for someone else to catch up. In London in September of 1966, Chandler connected Jimi with drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding to form the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The British music scene in 1966 was, without question, the most fertile creative environment in the world. The Beatles were still together. The Rolling Stones were at their early peak. Cream was forming. Eric Clapton was considered a god, and not metaphorically. People wrote Clapton as God on walls in London and meant it with complete earnestness. Then Jimi Hendrix showed up and played Killing Floor at a club called the Bag O' Nails, while Eric Clapton sat in the audience and watched. Clapton, by his own account later given in multiple interviews, had to leave midway through the set and stand outside. He told Chandler afterward that he wanted to quit music. He was not joking. The Jimi Hendrix Experience released their debut album, Are You Experienced?, in May of 1967. It was recorded in 3 months at Olympic Sound Studios in London. The cost of recording was approximately £8,000, which in 1967 was a significant investment for a debut record from an unknown American artist, backed by a British label. The album sold 300,000 copies in the United Kingdom alone within its first 6 months. In the United States, where the racial politics of rock and roll were considerably more complicated, it still reached number 5 on the Billboard album chart. The singles Purple Haze and The Wind Cries. Mary established a sonic vocabulary that did not previously exist. Critics struggled to describe what the experience was doing because the genre categories available at the time were not built for it. Between 1967 and 1969, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released 3 studio albums. Axis, Bold as Love arrived in December of 1967. Electric Ladyland, a double album, was released in October of 1968 and debuted at number 1 on the Billboard chart. The combined commercial performance of these 3 records, including touring revenue, generated an estimated $4 million during this 2-year period, the equivalent of approximately $32 million in contemporary value. Jimi was paid poorly by industry standards for those records because his management and recording contracts had been structured at a time when no one had any real sense of what he was going to become. By 1968, those contracts were among the most lopsided in the music industry, a situation that would generate litigation for decades after his death. The live shows were a phenomenon unto themselves. At the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 1967, Jimi performed in front of approximately 90,000 people and ended the set by pouring lighter fluid on his guitar and setting it on fire. This was not a gimmick he had prepared for weeks. It was a spontaneous decision made in the moment, a piece of performance art executed in real time with the calm of someone who had been thinking about it for years without knowing it. The footage of that moment, Jimi kneeling over the burning guitar with his hands raised, became one of the defining images of the decade. At Woodstock in August of 1969, performing as the final act of the festival before a crowd that had swelled to approximately 400,000 people, Jimi played the Star-Spangled Banner alone on his Stratocaster. He did not play it straight. He played it through feedback and distortion, bending the notes to evoke the sounds of bombs dropping and planes flying overhead, turning the national anthem into a psychedelic indictment of the Vietnam War, and simultaneously one of the most technically demanding guitar performances in the history of the instrument. It lasted approximately 3.5 minutes. It has since been called the greatest electric guitar performance ever committed to recording by dozens of critics and musicians across the intervening decades. In 1968, Jimi began the process of building Electric Lady Studios in New York City, a state-of-the-art recording facility located at 52 West 8th Street in Greenwich Village, not far from the clubs where he had played for $30 a night just 2 years earlier. The construction cost approximately $1 million. Jimi financed it himself, partly through advances from his record label and partly through tour income. The studio was designed specifically to give him a space where he could record without the constraints of commercial studio time, where he could work through the night and come back the next afternoon, and the equipment would still be set exactly as he had left it. Electric Lady Studios opened in August of 1970 and remains operational today, having hosted recordings by artists including David Bowie, The Clash, Taylor Swift, and hundreds of others. He owned apartments in London and New York. He had traveled extensively through Europe, North Africa, and the American South. Not as a tourist, but as someone absorbing influences the way he had always absorbed music, by immersion and total attention. He drove a custom-painted Ford Mustang convertible. He wore handmade clothing, exotic fabrics purchased in markets across London's Portobello Road and in the boutiques of Carnaby Street. His wardrobe at its peak was valued at approximately $40,000, an extraordinary figure for 1969. He wore it all with the specific kind of elegance that only works when the person wearing it is completely unself-conscious about it. In the summer of 1970, there were signs that something was not right. The creative pressure had become immense. The business problems surrounding his contracts were causing legal disputes that consumed enormous energy. He was experimenting with the formation of a new band called Band of Gypsies with Billy Cox and Buddy Miles, trying to find a new direction for music that had already gone further than anyone else had taken it. He was sleeping irregularly, eating poorly, and the pharmaceutical habits that had always existed on the edges of his life had moved toward the center. On the night of September 17, 1970, Jimi Hendrix attended a party at a flat in London's Notting Hill neighborhood and took a combination of wine and the sedative Vesparax. He returned to the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill in the early morning hours and went to sleep. He was found unresponsive by his girlfriend, Monica Danneman, the following morning, September 18th. Emergency services were called. He was transported to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital in Kensington. He was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 27 years old. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as asphyxiation due to inhalation of vomit, barbiturate intoxication, and open verdict, meaning the circumstances were not conclusively determined as accidental. He had been too famous to die quietly and too independent to have allowed the kind of protective infrastructure around him that might have prevented it. The flat was not sealed properly for hours. The circumstances of that morning have been debated and contested for 5 decades and remain officially unresolved. The music he left behind was not finished. At the time of his death, he had been working on a new album that was never completed. The recordings have been released in various configurations over the years, some authorized by his estate and some not. A legal situation that generated litigation that lasted more than 20 years and was only partially resolved when his father, Al Hendrix, who had survived his son by decades, took unified control of the estate in 1995. The Hendrix estate today generates an estimated $8 million annually from licensing, merchandise, continued album sales, and streaming revenue. Electric Lady Studios continues to operate at its original address in the same Greenwich Village neighborhood where a 23-year-old left-handed guitarist from Seattle used to play for $30 a night and wait for someone to understand what they were hearing. The guitarist who was challenged that night at Café Wah and who stepped aside after 1 minute never spoke disparagingly about what happened. Years later, in an interview, he said something that has stayed with everyone who read it. He said that watching Jimi play was the first time he genuinely understood that what he himself was doing with a guitar was a craft, and that what Jimi was doing with a guitar was something else. Something that did not have a clean word for it in English or in any other language. Something that arrived from a place that logic and practice and technique could point toward, but could never fully reach on their own. That is the story of Jimi Hendrix, a left-handed boy from Seattle who flipped a right-handed guitar upside down at 11 years old and spent the next 16 years finding sounds that no one had found before him, who was too good for every room he was in until London was finally large enough to contain him briefly, who built a studio in the neighborhood where he had been anonymous, and left behind a body of work so dense and so specific that musicians are still finding new things inside it more than 50 years after his death. He did not have time to become legendary slowly. He had 27 years, and he used every single one of them.